This week, we'll take issue with the war between Israel and Hamas, two old enemies locked in a deadly new conflict. But why now? What comes next? And what new urgency does it add to the search for a House Speaker? And the BRIC gets bigger after the Boston City Council approves funding for its controversial Regional Intelligence Center. I'm Cory.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Sue.
And this is Taking Issue.
Our nation was born here, not with a whimper, but with the spark of revolution.
One more indictment, and this election is closed out.
That's what democracy is. It's a choice of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Welcome to episode 2 of Taking Issue. The debut was so nice we decided to do it twice. I'm Cory Smith. We appreciate you being here. I am joined once again by NBC 10 Boston political commentator and analyst Sue O'Connell and NBC 10 Boston political reporter Matt Pritchard. Before we go any further, a little housekeeping. We are now wherever you get your podcasts. You can download new episodes of Taking Issue weekly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon, wherever you get them. We are there, so we definitely appreciate you being with us.
What do the kids say? It's like, subscribe, all those things.
Yeah, match that subscribe button.
Make sure
like
you
my
do
status, whatever you need. All right, let's move ahead to a certainly more serious topic. We're going to begin the pod overseas, the war between Israel and Hamas. On Saturday, October 7th, Hamas fighters infiltrated Israel by land, air, and sea, massacring innocent men, women, and children. Israel responded immediately, pounding Gaza with rockets and laying siege to the city, cutting off food, water, and electricity, and amassing hundreds of thousands of troops near the border. The death toll, sadly, continues to rise on both sides. More than 2,300 people killed in both Israel and Gaza. More than 24 Americans are among the dead. Obviously, we have been following the situation closely here in New England, but we are by no means experts on this topic. So we're going to hear from a few throughout the podcast. Before we get to that, let me just get both of your thoughts on what we've seen really as this conflict gets closer to its first week.
Well, I think the shock of what happened and the atrocities of what happened with the Hamas attack on Saturday. You know, I often have discussions with my daughter about where we can travel. You know, I'm a lesbian, I'm a woman, I'm a single parent. Where can we travel in the world where we feel safe? And Israel often comes up as a safe place because of the dome, because of the fence, because of the underground barriers. And none of that seemed to matter on Saturday with Hamas. And also just what this means for the world. Obviously, the toll that's happening on both the Gaza Strip and what happened on Saturday in Israel, but what that means for the rest of the world. We're certainly going to see players like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Russia and China and, of course, the United States involved in this from a geopolitical standpoint. So it's a very disturbing time, both because of what happened and because of what may be ahead.
And Matt, I'm sure you agree, we're watching this both through a political lens, but also just a humanity lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the horrific images that we're all unfortunately seeing play out on social media or on the news, just, you know, so tragic to look at no matter who you are, but just seeing how, kind of how Sue was mentioning, how the entire world is responding and reminding us that this conflict touches a lot of different areas. I mean, yes, it's happening in the Middle East, but it impacts us here in North America over to Europe and into Asia as well. Everyone seems to have a stake in this in some way, form, or fashion.
All right, so we're going to get to that in just a second. I want to play some sound from MSNBC earlier in the week, right on the heels of the conflict beginning. Katie Torr interviewing Ayman Mohyeldin, who has lived and worked in the region. He gave his thoughts on a sort of, I guess, short-term and long-term solution to the conflict. Let's listen.
The short-term solution to this is for Israel to recover the hostages that have been taken into Gaza. I think that's
trading the prisoners?
That is going to be a decision that Israel has to make, because it's going to have to decide on what is the value of the Israeli lives that it wants to save and whether or not it wants to release them through, as they have in the past, negotiations for prisoner swaps. Keep in mind that from a Palestinian perspective, Israel has thousands of Palestinians, including women and children, that are held, many of them in arbitrary detention, many of them who have not had a fair judicial process. So when you're asking for the release of the Palestinians, it's not that you're asking for the release of terrorists. Israel is going to say they are terrorists, but the truth to the Palestinians is those are not terrorists. Those are women and children that are being held illegally out of a legal framework by Israel. put that aside because that's the short-term question to how do you get out of this situation. But if you're trying to solve the long-term process, which is how do you get a mechanism in place that allows these two sides to sit around the negotiating table, is you have to speak clearly about what the roots of the root problems are. And it's not going to be writing a blank check to Israel to give it the belief that it can do whatever it wants. Part of the reason why we are in this mess is that year after year, decade after decade, the Israeli government, subsequently, have been told by the West that they can do whatever they want and get a blank check from the United States. And in doing so, the end result is you get a government in Israel that believes the Palestinian issue is not fundamental to the core problem in the region, and the false belief that making peace with countries beyond the Palestinians is going to come back and solve the Palestinian issue. As we have seen, and not to go off on a tangent, but as we've seen, Israel has peace with Egypt since 1979. It has peace with Jordan. It now has peace with the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, all the most important countries in the Arab world with the exception of Saudi Arabia, potentially on the horizon soon. None of that prevented what happened today.
All right, so Eamon talking about the short-term hostages being released on both sides. We'll see if that comes to fruition. We're certainly not hearing a lot from Benjamin Netanyahu, the IDF, about that happening. But looking at the larger context of sort of why now, why this happened, and as we've been kind of following this and reading this, one piece of information that really stood out to me was some analysis that was done by Reuters, and they spoke to Laura Bloomfield at she's a Middle East analyst at Johns Hopkins University for Advanced International Studies, and she said Hamas may have lashed out due to a sense that it was facing irrelevance as efforts advanced toward broader Israeli-Arab relations. Going back to the Trump administration, we have seen some normalization between Israel and Arab countries, United Arab Emirates, Sudan, perhaps maybe even looking forward to Saudi Arabia. And in that same Reuters article, they quoted Osama Hamdan, the leader of Hamas in Lebanon, saying that the operation should make Arab states realize that accepting Israeli security demands would not bring peace. He said, quote, "For those who want stability and peace in the region, the starting point must be to end the Israeli occupation. Some Arab states, unfortunately, started imagining that Israel could be the gateway for America to defend their security." Can we see any sort of solution to this without really addressing the Israeli-Palestine conflict in any sort of meaningful way, understanding what is happening on both sides of this war?
So I don't have an answer to that, Cory, obviously, because if I did, I would be over there fixing it all. But I can tell you from the conversations I've had prior to this war, last year, and especially during COVID, I spoke to a number of younger Israelis, under 35, in the arts. They were both folks that were based in the United States and in Israel, and who were working on projects with their counterparts who were Palestinian, either on Gaza or here or in Europe. And many of them would express to me that they felt that they could politically find a solution, that they could work together to find peace. Of course, the political landscape in Israel with Netanyahu, they were not necessarily supportive of him in any way. Of course, the country is unified now, as one would hope they would, to address this horror. But I think that there's going to have to be discussions about how to deal with the civilian Palestinians who are living on Gaza and have nowhere to go. I mean, as we're learning right now, they're being told to evacuate. They can't go into Egypt. They can't go into Israel. They can't leave by water. There's nowhere for them to go. So if they can't go somewhere and it continues to be an issue, and it's the Middle East problem, it's Israel's challenge, there's going to have to be some discussion.
And that's one thing that we've heard journalists in Israel bring up is, obviously this conflict is not new, and in the past when Hamas has struck Israel and Israel has responded in kind, the rhetoric that you would hear from the IDF, from Netanyahu, was we are going to take care to minimize civilian casualties. Whether or not you believe them to actually take that approach is not the issue, at least for this conversation, but they were at least saying it. You hear from some journalists in Israel now, and they're worried that you are not hearing Netanyahu say that, which then leads you to think, are they just indiscriminately going to attack Gaza because that's where Hamas is? And I think that's another larger point that we've seen throughout the coverage is making sure to understand that Palestine, like any place, is not a monolith. There are people over there who are horrified by what Hamas has done, who want an independent state, but not by those means. And I think it's important when you hear people say Hamas does not equal Palestine, and on the other side, the Israeli government does not equal all Israelis or all Jews, no matter where they are across the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this conflict's been going on for so long. I mean, that's why it's so difficult, I think, for us as journalists to sometimes cover it, because it has so many different pieces to the puzzle that have all led to this sort of inflection point that you're talking about, Cory, where the rhetoric has started to shift a little bit on both sides. You know, I think the New York Times had a really good piece where they went in and talked with someone in Gaza who was talking about how inside of their homes they actually have these safe rooms where they've been ready to go inside whenever they have these sort of bombings that will happen. When they knew things had changed is that they could hear the terrorists outside of their windows shooting through those buildings. And so it kind of puts it in perspective that we've shifted here. This crisis has changed from what we've seen in the past to what we're seeing now.
Obviously, it has plenty of implications here at home as well. Speaking of rhetoric, you look at the reaction from lawmakers on the Hill, somewhat a bipartisan response, obviously horrified by the atrocities that happened to the Israelis. But then you're seeing this sort of split, certainly on the left, from more progressive members of Congress who say what Hamas did was terrible, but we have to look at the broader context of what Israel has done to the Palestinian people in terms of, you know, we hear the phrase open air prison used a lot when you talk about Gaza. Even this week, we had Senator Ed Markey and Congressman Jake Auchincloss at the same event, speaking to the same crowd. Ed Markey was booed for saying that there needed to be a de-escalation in the situation. Jake Auchincloss said, how can you de-escalate when you have one side aiming for the complete annihilation of the other? Now, as the U.S. continues to send aid to Israel, are we going to see, do you think, more of a sort of shift, a divide on the left?
No, I think, you know, if we just look at Ed Markey, I mean, there's probably nobody. I mean, he is equal to everyone who is as pro-Israel as there is. That's Ed Markey. There's no question about Ed Markey's support for Israel or his work for Israel. And to his comment, I think he might have misspoke a little bit. I mean, obviously, when you're under attack, you retaliate. But, you know, I remember how we all felt after 9/11 and how in the months after we rushed into Iraq, you know, and now I think we can all look back and say maybe that was not the best thing to do at the time, you know, when after the UN hearings and talking about weapons of mass destruction, maybe we needed to take a moment and consider what we're doing, which I think is what Markey was expressing. And obviously, Auchincloss has an understanding as well in responding that the right thing to do if you're a supporter of people who are being attacked is to say they have the right to defend themselves, which I think is what Auchincloss was saying. When you get to the further left, I mean, you've already seen AOC pushing back against the Democratic Socialists or Socialist Democrats who were busy waving flags and being disruptive at an Israeli support rally last week in New York. And she pushed back and said, this is not the time for that. So I think there's going to be some self-correction for the progressives and also a lesson. I mean, you know, we look at these elected officials. Some of them have only been in office a handful of years, and this might be their first crisis. The first thing you always do is affirm and acknowledge the atrocities that have happened. Affirm and acknowledge your allies and what they have the right to do, which is to defend themselves. And if there's time to add context, that time always comes. It doesn't have to be in your first statement.
What do you think President Biden is saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu? Obviously, he has reiterated very firmly the U.S. stands with Israel, but from just a diplomatic relations standpoint, solving this problem or finding some sort of solution, can you just be talking to Israel about Israeli security and not talk about what's happening in the West Bank?
Yep. So there's a cost here for both and I'm talking purely political, for both Hamas and for Israel. Again, not a Middle East expert, but I have to believe that Hamas was shocked at the lack of resistance that they faced when they crossed over into Israeli territory. I think that they had no intention of causing the amount of atrocities and the amount of damage that they expected. And I think every security expert you've heard around the world is talking about how shocking it is that the Israeli soldiers weren't there, there wasn't law enforcement there, that none of their security worked, how long it took for them to respond. So having said that, I don't know if Hamas expected to have this sort of result, and therefore make Israel respond to the degree that they have, which is understandable. So I also think that Biden and Netanyahu are talking about the hostage situation. Israel in the past has traded hundreds of prisoners for one Israeli soldier. There are a number of hostages being held, including Americans, and you can imagine that this response from Israel would put them in some sort of danger. So I imagine that's what they're talking about now, and what the result will be, right? What Israel's response with their attack and their response to on the strip will have with the neighbors in the surrounding area. Again, to our earlier point, there's no doubt that Iran is involved in this, and there's no doubt that many are thinking that Russia is involved in this as well. So this is a very, very precarious situation for everyone. So I imagine that Biden is offering as much counsel as Netanyahu.
Matt, you've been in New Hampshire all week. How is this playing out on the campaign trail?
Every single candidate we've spoken with have made this basically the first thing that they address in whatever speech it is. We had Donald Trump on Monday, who said that if he was put back in office, well, he first says if he would have never left, this wouldn't have happened. Of course, that's a typical thing that he says when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but now it's transitioning to what's happening in Israel. He also said that he's the only one who can solve it. And honestly, that's what a lot of the other GOP candidates are saying as well. This is filing week in New Hampshire. If you're familiar with how this goes, essentially the candidates make their way to Concord. They go in the Secretary of State's office. They have to file in person, and then they sit down at the table and talk to New Hampshire media and the national media as a whole. What I've found interesting is that, New Hampshire media, normally you'd kind of expect them to focus just on the Granite State and the voters there, but they're even asking more about Israel than anything else, and then the national media follows up. Each candidate has said that they feel like the Biden administration hasn't gone far enough to try and protect Israel and to show support. They've chastised Congress for not getting their act together in the House and having a speaker so that they can put forward resolutions and funding to assist Israel. And that's Ron DeSantis, that's Doug Burgum, that's Asa Hutchinson, and a couple other candidates as well. So you're starting to see that this is going to be a major point as we go throughout this election cycle. The next GOP debate is in November. I guarantee you we're going to hear a lot about it.
We'll get to the speaker search in just a second, but I want to bring it home here to Boston and what we've seen on campuses across the area. You had, in the wake of the attack, nearly 36 pro-Palestinian student groups at Harvard send out a statement that received plenty of backlash from alums, civic leaders, economic leaders. Then you had the university send its own statement out, responding to that statement. The university statement received backlash. So then you had the president send out her own statement about what's happening and how the feelings of those groups don't represent Harvard as a whole. What do you make of the response on the universities in and around Boston, where you obviously have a large Jewish Israeli student population, but also you have folks who have who have been directly impacted by the history between these two countries, Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, I think you give me the easy questions, Cory.
Sorry.
The first response, and I think that the mistake, this is why you go to college, right? This is why you go to school, so you can learn things. The first response is always to acknowledge that the atrocities are atrocities, and this is a terrible thing. There is no moral equivalent, right? Killing babies, burning babies, herding 15-year-old girls into a room and murdering them there's no moral equivalent to anything that has happened to people that would equal that. So you have to denounce that immediately. And then, if you are supporters of Palestinian peace or a two-state solution or are concerned about the way the Israeli government has treated Palestinians, you need to delineate that from anti-Semitism and be clear that Jews all around the world are often targeted. We've got data here in the United States that it is a terrible time to be a Jewish American right now, with all sorts of crimes and graffiti and hate speech directed at Jews in America, American Jews, so that you need to couch what you're going to say with those realities. And also, it would have been a great moment for the Palestinian groups to stand with Israel, to stand with the Palestinian civilians, and to denounce Hamas, which I didn't really see in any of those statements, that you can be a supporter of Palestinians and denounce Hamas, which I don't think they did clearly. And I also think just some of the school, also it's happening with the superintendents, I think that there is sometimes a carefulness that catches you up. We don't want to denounce humanity. We don't want to denounce innocent Palestinians who are, by a lottery of birth, born there for generations and have nowhere to go. But at the same time, you can denounce the actions of their government, which is what, threading the needle.
In some ways, it sort of strikes me as similar to the reaction we have when there's a school shooting. The school shooting happens, and immediately you have one side say, now is the time to focus on the victims and the families and praying for them. And the other side saying, the gun control side saying, no, now is the perfect time to talk about the gun issue in America. And you sort of had that sort of dynamic at play here. No, now is the time to recognize the atrocities and everything that has happened. And then other folks saying, well, now is the time to really drill down on why it happened.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you're saying. I mean, these crisis moments are just difficult, I think, for everyone to address. I mean, you mentioned there's been outlash to the Harvard situation from a lot of different people in Boston politics, too. I mean, Congressman Auchincloss is a Harvard grad, and said that he was ashamed
of his alma mater.
Of his alma mater. And so, it's just like everyone, I feel like everyone's almost frozen in a way. People are reacting in 7 different ways, and which way is the best way? And I think Sue hit it on the head. There's a right way to do this, which is the first step, and the steps you take after that can kind of make their way after that. But if you miss that first step, anything you do after that can be completely misconstrued.
And context, context is important. And I think anytime anyone can add context, this is a civilization, a region that's been populated by a civilization for at least 5,000 years, right? We're not going to be able to sum it all up in a couple of minutes. And so it's just important to give the context as objectively as you can while acknowledging the atrocities that are happening and the innocent civilians that are always everywhere.
So as it relates to the U.S. response, we know they are sending aid, munitions to Israel, but getting more out is compounded by the fact that we still don't have a Speaker of the House of Representatives. We have a, front runner, or what we thought was going to be a front runner. The GOP conference said Steve Scalise. A majority of them said Steve Scalise is our guy. But a majority in the conference is not the 217 votes he needs to ascend to the Speaker. We've already seen nearly a dozen lawmakers say, nope, not my guy. I want Jim Jordan or somebody else. Are we going to have a Speaker by episode 3? I think I asked you if we're going to have a Speaker by episode 2.
So we're talking here on Thursday, Scalise needs every single Republican to vote for him in order to go forward.
Wait, Democrats? No Democrats are going to vote for him?
I can't imagine. Oh, let's see if they're going to, So I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, I think McHenry, who is the pro tempore speaker, I've been reading a lot on this, and maybe you guys know better than I, but they're not sure what powers he does or doesn't have. They haven't. So
you hear the word unprecedented used a lot in this situation.
So maybe he'll just stay and
to get it done.
To get the funding.
And I read today was that a group of Republican lawmakers were trying to find sort of a way to give him temporary powers through November so we can get some of these things done. By the way, a government shutdown, how far away now? 20 days? So, I mean, Israel, government shutdown. Ukraine, it couldn't be busier right now for Congress, and they can't operate.
And I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, everybody keeps asking, what do you think is going to happen? If you can, I mean, these are 2 leaders, Jim Jordan and Scalise, regardless of what you think of them, they're leaders in their party, right? And even though they're conservative, they're somewhat, everyone likes them, I mean, you can dislike them like you see them on TV, but people have good interactions
It's
with
a gun
them.
violence survivor. You can't.
Right.
got
Cancer
blood
survivor.
cancer. You can't.
know,
You, like.
but if these guys can't get elected, then who?
Yeah, well, and I also find it curious, Jim Jordan kind of falling in line, right, and backing Scalise. We saw him do the same thing back in January with McCarthy.
That's right, I forgot.
When a bunch of these people on the sort of the
Right.
hardliners of the party were saying, you know, like, we want Jim Jordan. He's like, no, like, we're going, that's our guy. You realize how damaging this is to show the nation that we can't govern, we're dysfunctional, all these different things. So, hey, it's just fascinating to your point, Sue, that like leaders are going to be leaders, but they can't keep the rest of the conference in line.
Well, I'll tell you, a penny for Kevin McCarthy's thoughts, because here he is sitting in the back and watching, it all go down.
And they introduced him in the conference as what, Speaker Pro Tem, like, or Emeritus or whatever
Emeritus,
it was.
yeah, Emeritus.
Yeah.
He's not dead, he's still here.
Yeah.
All right, let's come home. In the last few weeks, there has been a lot of talk about the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, more commonly known as BRIC, and a controversial vote that was taken at Boston City Hall on whether or not to accept federal grant to expand the BRIC. So I know you've been digging into this issue. What have you found?
Well, so as you mentioned, the vote happened in October, and the city council split. The vote was 7-5, with the white city councilors voting to fund it and the councilors of color voting to oppose it. This BRIC was formed in 2005. The idea was that it would fight terrorism and share information with federal agencies, state agencies, and local agencies for all threats and hazards. That's sort of the mission of it, from just your basic homicide investigations to school bomb threats or the hospital threats that we had earlier in the year. And people are, of course, concerned about this because people of color are often the victims of this sort of surveillance, and many say that the idea that it's stopping things isn't really working. So I spoke with Kate Crockford. She is the director of Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU in Massachusetts. I asked her if BRIC was a necessity for law enforcement to fight terrorism and local crime. Here's what she said.
One of the issues that we see here is we see local governments, for example, the Boston Police Department, telling the elected representatives of the Boston City Council that we need the Fusion Center because of gang violence. We need the Fusion Center because of the important role that the analysts at the Fusion Center play in analyzing data about gun violence in Boston, and that is crucial for our anti-violence efforts on the streets of Boston. Well, that's very interesting because I read the documents that the Boston Police Department sent to DHS about what this grant money was going to be used for. And it said that it was going to be used for 100% anti-terrorism intelligence work. So again, we have this kind of mismatch between what the police are telling the public and the city council about why we need the Fusion Center and about the important role that the Fusion Center plays. And frankly, as a report from Congress a number of years ago found, again, this was a report put together by Republicans, not Democrats, Fusion Centers had not contributed anything, not a single thing, to the federal counterterrorism effort, and even worse, had violated people's rights in countless ways across the country.
So interesting there, and I know at least the conversation on social media and a bulk of the conversation was about the gang database,
right?
More than the terrorism that was just mentioned. Were you surprised to see that vote come down along those, not just racial lines, maybe generational lines as well?
Yeah, I was actually more surprised that Michelle Wu had forwarded this along with Michael Cox, who is our Boston Police Superintendent. Michael Cox, of course, Commissioner, had a very troubling interaction as a Boston police officer, and has returned. He's obviously African American. Michelle Wu, a progressive, also a minority. And when she was a city councilor just a couple of years ago, she voted to block the grant funding for BRIC. And she has changed her position, obviously, by forwarding the idea that BRIC needs more money. She has cited the new Office of Police Accountability and Transparency and the reforms in the gang database. I asked Crockford what she made of Wu's change of mind.
I think Mayor Wu is right that the surveillance oversight ordinance does improve things quite a bit in Boston. But really what that ordinance does is it brings the city council and the public into kind of the process of thinking about what technologies the Boston Police Department is using and what policies govern the use of those technologies. So it's not a panacea. It's not, it doesn't overnight address all of the issues that Boston and many other cities, I just want to say again, this is not just Boston. This is most cities across the country dealing with the same issues.
How much of any sort of re-election bid do you think Wu's change of heart could have been based on?
Well, I think that's always, especially at this point in her term, that's always top of mind. But I also think there's something happens between being a Boston City Councilor and then becoming the mayor. And, we also saw it with Barack Obama when he was a senator and then he became president and Gitmo's still open, right? There is information you get that you don't have access to when you're a leader as opposed to someone who's working and dealing with constituent services. So I think that there are things that were shown to Michelle Wu that made her believe that with the guardrails that she thinks that she's put in place and with Michael Cox in position, that therefore it can be an effective tool. But I also think, yes, she's certainly going to have a challenge from, I don't want to say the right because it's Boston, but from her right side.
But even opponents mentioned, a lot of the talk was about the gang database, but and this is before you joined the station. A lot of the opponents said if this is such a great tool at stopping, people who would come to Boston to do us harm, how did they not know that a group of white supremacists were going to show up around America's birthday and assault a man or allegedly assault a man because it's going through the court system? What have you heard about those talks? Because on the other side, you have, just this past week or maybe 2 weeks ago, a young boy disappeared and apparently the Regional Intelligence Center stepped in to help. I've been inside these fusion centers. It's police working with sheriff's deputies, working with fire departments, working with first responders and EMS crews. Some would say it serves its purpose, some would say it's not, but I mean, it's here to stay at this point here in Boston.
My friends in law enforcement would say, you don't know what it is that they are stopping. And you also don't know what it is that they're allowing to happen, right? So, if the guys who jumped in the U-Haul for the 4th of July, maybe they knew they were coming and they were going to let them come. To see what was going to happen. So there's things that we don't know. I'm not defending it. The gang database, definitely problematic because you could be in a gang database just for living next door to someone who's in it. But I did ask our ACLU guest here, what improvements would she like to see made to BRIC?
This controversy over funding the BRIC has been an important moment in Boston politics. And it's an important moment, I think, for folks in the council, for people in the administration, and for those of us in the advocacy community to sit back for a second and think clearly about what it is that we actually want to change at the BRIC, what it is that we want to change at the Boston Police Department. And I would, put out there that I think one of the things that we ought to do is look at whether it's a new ordinance or it's changes to existing policy that govern how information is collected and shared and processed at the BRIC, that we ought to think about, a kind of trust act approach, right? Maybe the approach isn't to say, well, the BRIC can't exist anymore. Maybe it's instead to say, at first at least, well, the BRIC shouldn't be collecting and processing and sharing information about people unless those people are suspected of criminal activity. I think that's probably, a pretty good starting place that a lot of people in Boston could get behind.
So certainly going to be something that we could potentially see play out in the city council elections. The funding's coming.
Yeah.
But moving forward, what that program looks like certainly is going to be an issue. And I know we're less than a month out, maybe a month out from city council elections. I know you've been speaking with some candidates in some of the big races. Have they touched on this issue? And if not, what sort of issues are you hearing from them?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard about this specific issue. I always learn something when Sue O'Connell starts talking. She knows all these things. They're really concerned about a wide range of things. I mean, I think mass and caste brings a lot of people just to the table automatically, and it's really every district. They're all concerned about it. They want to try and do something about that. They also, I think an interesting question was just the dysfunction that we've seen on the city council and trying to temper that. And it was like, most of them said they just want to be the adult in the room and start to have conversations again among colleagues so that progress can happen. And maybe that sort of rolls into what you're talking about, Sue, is if we can get a city council that can have conversations and actually be constructive, maybe things like this can move forward in a better picture for all of Boston. I don't know if you see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge that we have locally for crime is there's two challenges, I think. One is that things are underreported, and it's confusing why it's underreported. You would think the police and neighborhoods would want to report more so they can get more funding and get more addressed. We also have, the other part of it would be people are calling 911 less because of the impact of BLM and the violence that some police have put on people. So a lot of people are just not calling 911 for small things
And
anymore.
the difficulty of dealing with those 911 calls that are based around mental health issues.
Right. So you've got those as well. And we still have a large number of unsolved shootings in the city. I don't know if BRIC is something that would help by sharing data and information from those shootings that would help, because it's not just Boston. Like, people don't live in Boston and just shoot Boston people. We all know that. It's a whole regional issue. So those, I think, are the issues that are the day-to-day crime issues that we experience here in the city. We focus a lot on Mass and Cass, as we should, and the dangerous situation that is there, but that's also in this area with problems that are hard to solve but are still getting a lot of attention. But throughout the neighborhoods, we still have other problems.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there for this week. We appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Taking Issue. Of course, you can also join us this Sunday morning on At Issue at 11:30 on NBC 10 Boston, right after Meet the Press. For Matt Pritchard, Sue O'Connell, I'm Cory Smith. Enjoy your day. We'll see you next time.